Welcome to History's Secret Wars. The map of the Western Hemisphere is shaped like a chaotic hourglass. Two massive continents, North and South America, are joined by a slender, twisting waste of land, a geological accident that separates the Atlantic from the Pacific by a mere 50 miles of rock and jungle. For centuries, this narrow strip of land, the Isthmus of Panama, was the most tantalizing and frustrating geographic feature on Earth. It was the barrier that forced ships to sail 8,000 miles around the treacherous, storm-battered tip of South America at Cape Horn to get from New York to San Francisco. It was the obstacle that stifled global trade and complicated naval strategy. To the great powers of the world, the nation that could cut through this land and unite the oceans would hold the keys to the 20th century. This is the story of how that cut was made. But it is not just a story of engineering and steam shovels. It is a story of high-stakes diplomatic poker, of a dying empire realizing it had to retreat, and of a rising superpower ruthless enough to steal a country to build a ditch. It is the story of how the United States seized the Panama Canal, and the heavy price Great Britain paid to secure an American alliance. To understand the climax of this drama in 1903, we must first look back at the centuries of failure that preceded it. Since the days of the Spanish conquistadors, men had looked at the isthmus and dreamed of a path. King Charles V of Spain ordered a survey in 1534, but his governors reported that it was impossible, claiming that what God has joined, let no man put asunder. The Scottish kingdom, in a desperate bid for imperial glory in the late 1600s, tried to establish a colony there called the Darien Scheme. It ended in total catastrophe, bankrupting Scotland and forcing it into a union with England. The jungle was a green hell, guarded by yellow fever, malaria, and venomous snakes. It swallowed armies and fortunes alike. By the mid-19th century, the dominant power in the region was not the United States, but Great Britain. The British Empire, with its supreme Royal Navy, understood the strategic value of Central America. They controlled Belize, the Mosquito Coast of Nicaragua, and various islands in the Caribbean. They were the gatekeepers. In 1850, as the United States began to look outward, it found its path blocked by British influence. The two nations, wary of each other, signed the Clayton-Bulwer Treaty. This diplomatic agreement was essentially a stalemate. It stipulated that neither the United States nor Great Britain would ever obtain exclusive control over any ship canal built through Central America. They agreed that any canal would be neutral, unfortified, and open to all. It was a handcuff treaty, designed to prevent either power from gaining a decisive advantage. For 50 years, this treaty stood as the law of the land. It checked American ambition, but as the 19th century drew to a close, the United States underwent a metamorphosis. It transitioned from an agrarian republic to an industrial colossus. The American Civil War had forged a powerful federal government, and the factories of the North were churning out steel and machinery at a rate the world had never seen. A new generation of American leaders, disciples of the naval strategist Alfred Thayer Mahan, began to argue that sea power was the key to national greatness. And sea power required a canal, but not a neutral canal, an American canal. The catalyst for this shift in thinking was the Spanish-American War of 1898. When war was declared against Spain, the U.S. battleship USS Oregon was stationed in the Pacific, in San Francisco. To join the fight in Cuba, it had to steam all the way around South America. The voyage took 67 days. The American public and military planners watched in agony as the ship crawled around the continent while the war hung in the balance. It was a stark lesson. If the United States was to be a two-ocean power, it could not afford to have its navy divided by a continent. The canal was no longer a commercial luxury, it was a military necessity. However, the Clayton-Bulwer Treaty still stood in the way. Great Britain still held the legal veto over any American canal project. In London, the British Foreign Office viewed the treaty as a valuable strategic asset, a bargaining chip to be held against the Americans. But the world was changing fast. In 1900, Britain found itself bogged down in a brutal, unpopular war against the Boers in South Africa. The British Army was humiliated by guerrilla farmers. European rivals like Germany and Russia were circling, eager to take advantage of British weakness. The British Empire was overstretched, isolated, and financially drained. In the halls of Whitehall, a cold calculation was being made. Britain could no longer afford to be the enemy of everyone. They needed a friend. And across the Atlantic, the boisterous, aggressive United States was demanding the right to build its canal. The question for Britain was fight to keep the old treaty and risk making an enemy of the rising American giant, or tear up the treaty, give the Americans what they wanted, and hope to buy their friendship. The decision they made would reshape the geopolitics of the Western Hemisphere forever. Before the United States could seize the canal, someone else had to fail, and that failure was spectacular, tragic, and French. In the 1880s, France was riding high on a wave of technological optimism. They had just completed the Suez Canal, a triumph of engineering that linked the Mediterranean to the Red Sea, slashing the travel time to India and making its creator, Ferdinand de Lesseps, a national hero. De Lesseps was known as the Great Frenchman. He was charismatic, determined, and utterly convinced of his own genius. When he turned his eyes to Panama, he saw it as just another Suez. He believed that with enough money and French élan, he could dig a sea-level canal through the Central American jungle. De Lesseps was not an engineer, he was a diplomat and a promoter. He ignored the warnings of geologists who told him that Panama was nothing like the flat, sandy desert of Suez. Panama was a geological nightmare of mountains, unstable soil, and torrential rains that turned rivers into raging floods. But his biggest mistake was biological. He underestimated the mosquitoes. In the late 19th century, the connection between mosquitoes and diseases like malaria and yellow fever was not yet proven. The French believed these diseases were caused by miasma, bad air rising from rotting vegetation. In 1881, the French construction began. It was a crusade of civilization. Thousands of French engineers and workers, along with laborers from the Caribbean, flocked to Panama. They brought with them the finest steam shovels and locomotives Europe could produce. They also brought their families, their wine, and their grand ambitions. But almost immediately, the dying started. Yellow fever was a terrifying killer. It struck with sudden, violent chills, followed by a high fever, jaundice that turned the skin yellow, and finally, the vomiting of black, coagulated blood. Death often came within days. The French hospitals, run by well-meaning nuns, became death traps. To protect the patients from ants, the nuns placed the legs of the hospital beds in bowls of water. These bowls became perfect breeding grounds for the Aedes aegypti mosquitoes, the carriers of yellow fever. The disease rampaged through the workforce. It is estimated that over 22,000 people died during the French attempt. There were stories of trains leaving the work sites every evening filled only with corpses. Morale collapsed. Engineers would arrive from France, only to be dead within a week. The project became known as the Coast of Fever. Compounding the biological disaster was the geological reality. De Lesseps had insisted on a sea-level canal, refusing to build locks. This meant digging a massive trench through the Culebra Cut, the spine of the Continental Divide. But as soon as the French dug, the mountains fought back. The unstable clay soil would slide into the excavation site every time it rained, burying machinery and men. It was like trying to dig a trench in a bowl of soup. The deeper they went, the more the land collapsed. Back in Paris, de Lesseps resorted to bribery and lies to keep the money flowing. He bribed journalists to write positive stories. He bribed politicians to approve lottery loans. He hid the death toll and the lack of progress. But the truth could not be suppressed forever. In 1889, the Compagnie Universelle du Canal Interocéanique collapsed. It was the largest financial crash in the history of the 19th century. Hundreds of thousands of French investors lost their life savings. The French government fell. De Lesseps and his son were put on trial for fraud. The Panama affair tore French society apart, fueling anti-Semitism and political cynicism. By the late 1890s, the French effort in Panama was a rusting, abandoned ruin. Locomotives sat swallowed by jungle vines. The great trench at Culebra was filled with mud. But the French still held one asset, the concession rights, to build the canal and the remnants of their equipment. A new company, the Compagnie Nouvelle, was formed to salvage something from the wreckage. Their only hope was to sell the rights to the only buyer with enough money and ambition to take over the United States of America. But the Americans weren't looking at Panama. They were looking at Nicaragua. In the turn of the century United States, the idea of a canal was popular, but the location was a subject of fierce debate. For decades, American engineers and politicians had favored a route through Nicaragua. The geography there seemed friendlier. A canal could utilize the vast Lake Nicaragua and the San Juan River, requiring less digging than the Panama route. It was closer to the United States ports. And crucially, it wasn't tainted by the French failure and the aura of death that surrounded Panama. The Nicaragua lobby in Congress was powerful, and by 1901, it seemed almost certain that the U.S. would dig its ditch there. But the French were desperate. If the U.S. chose Nicaragua, their Panama concession would be worthless. The French company hired a man named Philippe Bunau-Varilla to save their investment. Bunau-Varilla was a brilliant, arrogant, and manipulative French engineer who had worked on the de Lesseps project. He was obsessed with Panama. He viewed the completion of the Panama Canal as a vindication of French genius, even if America built it. He arrived in Washington, D.C. with a mission to convince the Americans that Nicaragua was dangerous and Panama was the only logical choice. Bunau-Varilla waged a one-man propaganda war. He lobbied senators, wined and dined newspaper editors, and published pamphlets. But the Nicaragua route still held the lead. Then, nature handed him a weapon. In May 1902, Mount Pelée on the Caribbean island of Martinique erupted, killing 30,000 people in minutes. It was a horrific reminder of the power of volcanoes. Bunau-Varilla seized on this. He argued that Nicaragua was volcano country. He pointed out that the proposed Nicaragua route passed dangerously close to the active volcano Momotumbo. The Nicaragua supporters in the Senate dismissed his claims, saying Momotumbo was dormant. But Bunau-Varilla pulled off a masterstroke of psychological warfare. He scoured the stamp shops of Washington, D.C. and found a specific Nicaraguan postage stamp. The stamp featured a beautiful landscape with Mount Momotumbo in the background spewing a plume of smoke. It was official proof, printed by the Nicaraguan government itself, that their volcano was active. Bunau-Varilla bought 90 of these stamps and pasted one on a sheet of paper for every U.S. senator. Below the stamp, he typed a simple caption, "An official witness of the volcanic activity on the Isthmus of Nicaragua." He placed these sheets on the desks of the senators just days before the final vote. The visual impact was undeniable. The fear of an American canal being destroyed by an eruption, like the city in Martinique, swayed the vote. On June 19, 1902, the U.S. Senate voted in favor of the Spooner Act, which authorized the president to purchase the French rights and build the canal in Panama, provided a treaty could be negotiated with Colombia, which owned Panama. If not, the president was authorized to go back to Nicaragua. The decision was made. Panama it would be. But before a single shovel could hit the dirt, the United States had to clear the diplomatic minefield. The first mine to defuse was the British Empire. This brings us back to the price Britain paid. The man in the White House, Theodore Roosevelt, and his Secretary of State, John Hay, made it clear to London that the old Clayton-Bulwer Treaty had to go. They demanded total American control. They wanted the right to build, own, and crucially, fortify the canal. This was a direct challenge to British naval supremacy. A fortified American canal meant the U.S. Navy could dominate both oceans, while Britain would be locked out. In the past, Britain would have refused, but the Boer War had been a harsh teacher. The British, realizing they could not fight a war in South Africa and defend Canada against the U.S. simultaneously, they needed to secure their western flank. In 1901, Lord Pauncefote, the British ambassador, signed the Hay-Pauncefote Treaty. It was a capitulation. Britain renounced its rights to a joint canal. They gave the U.S. a free hand to build and militarize the waterway. It was the greatest strategic retreat in British history, a handing over of the keys to the Western Hemisphere. Britain paid the price of its dominance in the Americas to gain an ally for the coming storms in Europe. With Britain out of the way, only one obstacle remained: the sovereign nation of Colombia. With the British neutralized and the French company eager to sell for $40 million, the United States turned its attention to Bogotá. Panama was not an independent country. It was a province of Colombia. It was a neglected, rebellious province, separated from the capital by impenetrable jungles. But legally, it was Colombian soil. To build the canal, the United States needed a treaty with the Colombian government granting them the rights to the land. Negotiations began in Washington between Secretary of State John Hay and the Colombian representative Tomás Herrán. The atmosphere was tense. The Americans were impatient, viewing the Colombians as obstructive and greedy. The Colombians, for their part, were deeply suspicious of American imperialism. They had seen what the U.S. had done in Cuba and Puerto Rico after the Spanish-American War. They feared that granting the U.S. a canal zone would be the first step toward losing their sovereignty over the entire isthmus. Under immense pressure, Herrán signed the Hay-Herrán Treaty in January 1903. The terms were generous by imperial standards, but humiliating for a sovereign nation. The U.S. would pay Colombia $10 million in gold and an annual rent of $250,000. In exchange, the U.S. would get a renewable lease on a 6-mile-wide strip of land across Panama. Herrán signed it, but he warned Hay that his government back home might not accept it. He was right. When the treaty reached Bogotá, it caused a political firestorm. Colombia was just emerging from a devastating civil war known as the Thousand Days' War. The government was weak, broke, and fiercely nationalistic. The Colombian Senate looked at the treaty and saw a violation of their constitution. Giving away a piece of national territory to a foreign power forever? It was unacceptable. Furthermore, they felt the price was too low. They knew the French company was getting $40 million from the Americans. Why should Colombia only get $10 million? They wanted a cut of the French money. In August 1903, the Colombian Senate voted unanimously to reject the treaty. They thought this was a negotiating tactic. They assumed the Americans would come back with a better offer. They misjudged Theodore Roosevelt completely. When the news of the rejection reached Washington, Roosevelt exploded. He did not see the Colombian Senate as a legitimate legislative body exercising its rights. He saw them as jackrabbits, bandits, and homicidal corruptionists. To Roosevelt, the canal was a project for the good of global civilization. Colombia, by blocking it, was acting against the interests of humanity. He was not a man who took no for an answer. Roosevelt was furious at the idea of being held hostage by what he considered a third-rate power. I do not think that the Bogotá lot of jackrabbits should be allowed permanently to bar one of the future highways of civilization, he wrote. He began to look for alternative solutions. The Spooner Act technically required him to pivot to Nicaragua if the Panama deal failed. But Roosevelt wanted Panama. He believed it was the superior route. He began to hint, in private conversations and leaked comments, that he might just take the canal zone by force. But an invasion of Colombia would be messy and unpopular. There was, however, another option. A cleaner, more deniable option. Panama had a history of rebellion against Bogotá. The Panamanian elite, who stood to make fortunes from the canal, were devastated by the Colombian Senate's rejection. If Panama were to declare independence, the United States could sign a treaty with the new nation and bypass Colombia entirely. But the Panamanians couldn't do it alone. They needed a guarantee. They needed to know that if they revolted, the U.S. would protect them from the Colombian army. Enter Philippe Bunau-Varilla once again. The Frenchman saw his $40 million sale evaporating. He rushed to capitalize on the crisis. He began to act as a conduit between the Panamanian rebels and the White House. A conspiracy was born not in the jungles of Panama, but in the luxury suites of the Waldorf Astoria Hotel in New York and the back rooms of Washington. It was a conspiracy to redraw the map of the world. The plot to sever Panama from Colombia was a complex web of interests, involving a French engineer, a Panamanian doctor, American lawyers, and the tacit approval of the President of the United States. The central figure among the Panamanian conspirators was Dr. Manuel Amador Guerrero. He was an aging physician employed by the Panama Railroad, a company owned by U.S. interests. Amador traveled to New York in September 1903, desperate for American support. He knew that without U.S. military backing, any revolution would be crushed by Colombian troops within days. He remembered previous failed uprisings where rebel leaders were executed by firing squad. He needed guns, money, and ships. In New York, Amador met with Philippe Bunau-Varilla in room 1162 of the Waldorf Astoria. This room would become the cradle of the Panama Republic. Bunau-Varilla took charge. He acted as if he held the proxy of the American government. He met with President Roosevelt and Secretary of State John Hay. While Roosevelt was careful never to explicitly say, "I will support a revolution," which would be an impeachable act of war against a friendly nation, he used what he called calculated indiscretion. He spoke hypothetically. He mentioned that if a revolution were to happen, the U.S. would be bound by an old 1846 treaty to maintain free transit across the isthmus. In the past, this meant stopping rebels from blocking the train. But Roosevelt hinted that it could also mean stopping Colombian troops from fighting on the train line. Bunau-Varilla read between the lines. He returned to room 1162 and told Amador, "The United States will protect you." He didn't have a signed paper, but he had Roosevelt's intent. Bunau-Varilla then did something extraordinary. He wrote the Panamanian Declaration of Independence himself. He designed a flag for the new country, which Amador's wife later resewed because it looked too much like the U.S. flag. He wrote a constitution. He even wrote the telegrams Amador was to send him once the revolution succeeded. It was a revolution in a box, designed by a Frenchman in New York. In exchange for this support and $100,000 of his own money to bribe the Colombian garrison, Bunau-Varilla demanded one thing: he wanted to be named the Minister Plenipotentiary of the new Republic of Panama to the United States. He wanted the power to negotiate the Canal Treaty. Amador was reluctant. Why should a Frenchman represent Panama? But he had no choice. No Bunau-Varilla, no American ships, no revolution. Amador agreed. He took the kit back to Panama, hiding the flag wrapped around his torso to avoid customs detection. Meanwhile, Washington began to move pieces on the board. The USS Nashville, a gunboat, was ordered to steam toward Colón, on the Caribbean coast of Panama. Other ships were moved into position on the Pacific side. The orders to the commanders were vague but suggestive. Prevent the landing of any armed force with hostile intent, either government or insurgent. By labeling the Colombian army as a force with hostile intent, Roosevelt was preparing to use the U.S. Navy to shield the rebels. In Panama, the conspirators were nervous. Rumors of the plot had leaked. The Colombian government in Bogotá, sensing trouble, dispatched a battalion of 500 sharpshooters, the tiradores, to reinforce the garrison in Panama. They were sailing toward Colón. If they arrived before the revolution started, the plot would fail, and Amador would likely face a firing squad. It was a race between the Colombian troop transport Cartagena and the American gunboat Nashville. Whoever reached Panama first would decide the fate of the canal. On November 2, 1903, the USS Nashville sailed into the harbor of Colón. The American commander, Commander Hubbard, saw the town was calm, but the next morning, the Colombian troopship Cartagena arrived. It carried 500 loyal troops commanded by Generals Tovar and Amaya. The revolution was in mortal danger. If these troops crossed the isthmus to Panama City, the rebellion would be crushed in its cradle. The Panamanian conspirators had a plan, however, that relied less on firepower and more on the corruption of the local officials. The Colombian railroad officials, who were part of the conspiracy, played a crucial trick. When Generals Tovar and Amaya landed in Colón, the railroad bosses greeted them with great fanfare. They told the generals that a special luxury train car was waiting to take them to Panama City to meet the governor. However, they claimed there weren't enough cars to transport the 500 soldiers yet. The soldiers would have to wait for the next train. The generals, eager for comfort and believing the situation was under control, boarded the train alone, leaving their army behind in Colón. This was the fatal mistake. As soon as the train left, the railroad officials ensured that no second train ever arrived. The soldiers were stranded in Colón, separated from their commanders by 50 miles of jungle. When Generals Tovar and Amaya arrived in Panama City, they were immediately arrested by the rebels. The trap was sprung. At the same time, the rebel leaders bribed the commander of the local Colombian garrison in Panama City, General Huertas. For $50,000 in gold, provided by Bunau-Varilla, Huertas agreed that his troops would not fight. He ordered his men to stack their rifles. On November 3, 1903, the fire brigade of Panama City rang its bells. It was the signal. Crowds gathered in the plaza. The independence of Panama was declared. There was almost no violence. The only casualty was a Chinese shopkeeper killed by a shell fired from a Colombian gunboat in the harbor, the only ship that refused the bribe. The gunboat fired a few rounds and then sailed away. Back in Colón, the situation was tenser. The 500 Colombian troops were furious. Their colonel threatened to kill every American in the town if his generals weren't released. Commander Hubbard of the USS Nashville finally received clear orders from Washington to prevent landing of Colombian troops. Since the troops were already landed, he interpreted this as prevent them from moving. He landed a detachment of Marines and sailors to fortify the railroad depot. He trained the Nashville's guns on the town. The Colombian colonel, facing American firepower and lacking his generals, eventually took a bribe of $8,000 and sailed his troops back to Colombia. The revolution was over in a matter of days. It was bloodless, engineered, and protected by American naval power. On November 6th, the United States formally recognized the Republic of Panama. It had been a sovereign nation for less than 3 days. Roosevelt had essentially created a country to do business with. The speed of the recognition scandalized Latin America and many in the U.S. Congress, but Roosevelt didn't care. He had his canal zone. Now, he just needed the treaty. With independence secured, a delegation of Panamanians, led by Dr. Amador, rushed to Washington to negotiate the Canal Treaty. They hoped to secure better terms than the rejected Hay-Haran Treaty. They wanted to maintain some dignity for their new nation. But Philippe Bunau-Varilla beat them to it. As the self-appointed Minister Plenipotentiary of Panama, he was already in Washington. He knew that the U.S. Senate still had a strong pro-Nicaragua faction. He needed to give Roosevelt a treaty so favorable, so irresistible, that the Senate would ratify it immediately. Bunau-Varilla sat down with Secretary of State John Hay and rewrote the treaty. He didn't just copy the old Colombian terms, he made them worse for Panama. He widened the canal zone from 6 miles to 10 miles. He granted the United States rights as if it were sovereign in the zone, essentially making it U.S. territory in everything but name. He made the lease not for 100 years, but in perpetuity forever. He worked through the night. When Amador and the Panamanian delegation arrived at Union Station in Washington, Bunau-Varilla met them on the platform. He pulled the treaty out of his pocket and said, "The Republic of Panama is henceforth under the protection of the United States. I have signed the treaty." Amador was stunned. He nearly fainted. A Frenchman had signed away the sovereignty of their new country forever, before a single Panamanian had even read the document. The Panamanians were furious, but Bunau-Varilla told them the cold truth: if they didn't ratify this treaty, the U.S. would withdraw its protection. Colombia would return, reconquer Panama, and execute the rebels. They had no choice. The Bunau-Varilla Treaty was ratified. The U.S. Senate approved it. Roosevelt had his canal. Roosevelt later famously boasted, "I took the isthmus, started the canal, and then left Congress not to debate the canal, but to debate me." It was the ultimate expression of the big stick policy. The United States had not just acquired a construction site, it had acquired a colony in the middle of Latin America. The friction caused by this treaty, signed by a Frenchman who immediately left Panama and never returned, would poison U.S.-Panama relations for the next 70 years. But in 1904, Washington wasn't worried about the future feelings of Panamanians. They had a job to do. They had to dig. The United States had the land, but now they had to succeed where the French had failed. In 1904, the Americans arrived in Panama to find the jungle reclaiming the French ruins. The first year was a disaster. The American chief engineer, John Wallace, was overwhelmed by the chaos. The bureaucracy was stifling, the food was rotting, and the diseases yellow fever and malaria began to strike again. Panic set in. American workers began to flee on the boats back home. It looked like the American effort would collapse just like the French one. But the Americans had a weapon the French did not: science. Dr. William Crawford Gorgas, an army doctor who had helped eradicate yellow fever in Havana, was sent to the canal zone. Gorgas knew the mosquito was the enemy, but the politicians in Washington and the canal commissioners didn't believe him. They thought his theories were nonsense. They refused to give him money for screens and fumigation. They wanted him to focus on cleaning up smells, not killing insects. The turning point came when a new chief engineer, John Stevens, was appointed in 1905. Stevens was a rough-and-tumble railroad man who had built the Great Northern Railway across the Rockies. He arrived in Panama and saw the demoralized workforce. He stopped all excavation. He told Washington, "I'm not digging a shovel of dirt until I make this place fit for human beings to live." He backed Gorgas 100%. He gave Gorgas a blank check. What followed was the greatest sanitation campaign in history. Gorgas unleashed an army of inspectors. They went house to house in Panama City and Colon. They fumigated every home. They drained swamps. They oiled every puddle of standing water to kill mosquito larvae. They installed copper screens on windows. They built a potable water system so people wouldn't store water in open barrels. It was a war of attrition against the insect. The results were miraculous. By late 1905, yellow fever had been eradicated from the canal zone. Malaria rates plummeted. The coast of death became one of the healthiest places in the tropics. With the workers safe, Stevens turned his attention to the logistics. He realized the French had failed because their machines were too small and their transport system was flawed. He rebuilt the Panama Railroad, turning it into a conveyor belt for removing dirt. He designed a system where the digging shovels never had to wait for an empty train car. He treated the canal not as a digging project, but as a railroad problem. Stevens also made the crucial decision to abandon the sea level plan. He realized the Culebra Mountains would never stop sliding. He convinced Roosevelt to build a lock canal, a massive bridge of water that would lift ships 85 feet above sea level, sail them across a man-made lake, Gatun Lake, and lower them down the other side. It was a bolder, safer, and more efficient plan. With the health crisis solved and the engineering plan set, the real digging could begin. The construction of the Panama Canal between 1904 and 1914 was the Apollo program of its era. It was a feat of industrial brute force. At the height of construction, over 40,000 men were working in the zone. The centerpiece of the battle was the Culebra Cut, the 9-mile slice through the Continental Divide. It was a scene from Dante's Inferno. The air was filled with the roar of dynamite explosions, the screech of steam shovels, and the thick coal smoke of hundreds of trains. The work was relentless and dangerous. Dynamite accidents were common, trains derailed. But the biggest enemy was the landslides. The geological strata of Culebra were unstable. Workers would dig out a section, and the next morning, the mountain would have slid back into the hole, burying tracks and steam shovels. These slides, like the Cucaracha slide, added years to the work and required moving millions of extra cubic yards of earth. But the new chief engineer, Colonel George Washington Goethals, who replaced Stevens in 1907, kept the army like discipline. "The only way to move the mountain," he said, "is to keep digging." But there is a darker side to this engineering triumph. The canal was built on a system of rigorous racial segregation. The American administrators imported a caste system. The skilled jobs, engineers, crane operators, foremen, were reserved for white Americans. They were paid in gold. They lived in comfortable houses with screens and electricity. They were the gold roll employees. The hard, physical labor was done by a massive workforce recruited from the West Indies, mostly black men from Barbados and Jamaica. There were also Spaniards and Italians. They were paid in local silver currency, which was worth half as much. They were the silver roll employees. They lived in crowded barracks, ate worse food, and did the most dangerous jobs. When dynamite exploded prematurely, or a rockslide crushed a crew, the victims were almost always silver roll men. Of the 5,600 official deaths during the American construction period, and likely many more unrecorded, the vast majority were black West Indian laborers. The canal is a monument to American engineering, but its foundation rests on the bones of Caribbean workers. Despite the hardships, the work progressed. The massive locks were built concrete cathedrals of water, with steel gates as tall as 6-story buildings. Gatun Dam, the largest earth dam in the world at the time, tamed the Chagres River. On August 15, 1914, the SS Ancon made the first official transit. The dream of centuries was realized. The oceans were joined. The world had shrunk. The opening of the Panama Canal in 1914 fundamentally changed the world. For the United States, it was the crowning achievement of its rise to superpower status. The U.S. Navy could now move between oceans in days, not months. The Caribbean became a firmly American sphere of influence, protected by the guns of the Canal Zone. The economic benefits were immense, reducing shipping costs and integrating the American east and west coasts. But the price of the canal was high, and not just in dollars. The taking of Panama left a deep scar of resentment in Latin America. For decades, the U.S. was viewed not as a good neighbor, but as an imperial bully, the Yankee colossus that would carve up countries to suit its needs. Colombia refused to recognize Panama for years, and the U.S. eventually paid Colombia $25 million in guilt money in 1921, after Roosevelt had died. For Britain, the canal represented the final passing of the torch. By accepting American control over the canal in the Pauncefote Treaty, Britain had officially retreated from the Western Hemisphere. They had traded their dominance in the Americas for American friendship. In the short term, it looked like a defeat. But just weeks before the canal opened in 1914, World War I broke out in Europe. As German submarines tried to strangle Britain, the value of that American friendship became priceless. The U.S., secure in its own hemisphere thanks to British withdrawal, eventually brought its industrial might and its navy through the canal to save Britain and the Allies. The price Britain paid in 1901 ended up buying its survival in 1917 and again in 1941. In Panama, the Canal Zone existed as a state within a state for nearly a century. It was a slice of America in the jungle, with American laws, American police, and American segregation. It was a constant source of friction with the Panamanian people, culminating in riots in the 1960s. Finally, in 1977, President Jimmy Carter signed the treaties that would return the canal to Panama. On December 31, 1999, the American flag was lowered for the last time, and the canal became fully Panamanian. Today, the Panama Canal remains a vital artery of global trade, recently expanded to handle the massive container ships of the 21st century. But beneath the water of Gatun Lake and the concrete of the locks lies a history of secret wars. It is a history of a British retreat, a French tragedy, a Colombian betrayal, and an American revolution. It serves as a reminder that the great monuments of civilization are often built on a foundation of intrigue, power, politics, and the ruthless pursuit of national interest. This has been a production of History Secret Wars. If you enjoyed this journey through the hidden corridors of history, please like, subscribe, and turn on notifications. The past is never as simple as it seems on the map. Join us next time as we uncover another secret war that shaped our world.